Well, hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Darwin Centre Live here at the Natural History Museum. My name's Aoife and I shall be your host for this event. I'd also like to join our viewers who are joining us over the internet. Now, today is another of our series of a week of events celebrating Richard Owen's 200th anniversary. And Richard Owen is credited with many amazing discoveries throughout his time. Two of the most amazing are perhaps, generally believed to be, in my opinion, the Natural History Museum itself, so here, and also the invention of dinosaurs. Now, we're joined today by Paul Barrett, who's a dinosaur researcher here at the museum in the paleontology department. So just to start us off, Paul, could you tell us a little bit about Owen himself and what he achieved?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. Owen was actually a very, very eminent Victorian scientist, one of the preeminent scientists of his day, and at the time he was considered to be the world's best anatomist, that is, interested in the structure and function of animals, both living and extinct. So he was a really prominent Victorian. He had lots and lots of projects that he worked on at any one different time, and his interest spanned the whole of the animal kingdom, everything from sponges all the way through to dinosaurs and gigantic mammals, and he even named the gorilla, for instance, so actually quite a wide set of interests.
So not just the ones he's perhaps most famous for is the dinosaurs, of course. How did he come to discover the dinosaurs?
It's quite an interesting story. Basically what had happened was, when we go back to the early part of the 19th century, objects like these started to appear from the soft rocks of southern England, mainly from Oxfordshire and Dorset and also from Sussex. And you would basically find bits and pieces. You would find the odd foot here and there, the odd spike, odd bit of armour, isolated jaws and isolated teeth. And people started to become interested in these and realised that some of them represented animals that were new to science and started giving them names like Iguanodon and Megalosaurus. But what Owen did was he saw that some of these animals that had been named and basically thought to be gigantic lizards were actually more to do with a special group of their own, and he recognised them as members of this special group.
So it was more that he looked at what other people had found and reanalysed it and then saw something different in it that no one else had seen before.
That's right. He made a key breakthrough and made this intellectual connection between these three different animals that nobody had yet seen. Up till that point, these three different animals were thought to be mainly giant lizards, scaled-up versions of giant iguanas, if you like.
Right.
But he was the first to realise there was something actually rather special and distinctive about them.
Right. So if I could just have a quick check in the audience here. Does anyone know what the word dinosaur means? Anyone?
Terrible lizard.
That's absolutely right, yes. Any idea why he called them that, as a guess?
Because the carnivores they're pretty terrible against plant eaters, and the plant eaters has terrible armor, which he saw was really can cause really terrible pain and they look quite terrible.
That's a really good idea. They do look quite terrible, and you're right, I think they would have been fairly terrible as either meat-eaters or in terms of their defences. But he actually named them that because they were so big. When he said terrible, he actually meant really big animals. And at the time, they thought that some of these things would be up to several hundred feet long, up more than 100 metres, based on this iguana-like model. But now we know that things are rather different from that.
So we've got a range of different dinosaurs now from what he originally thought. So this is one of the dinosaurs in the museum itself. This is the dinosaur gallery, I take it.
That's right, yes. It's not in this pose anymore. It's actually still in the dinosaur gallery. This is an iguanodon. So this is one of the original three animals that Owen recognised as part of his Dinosauria. And the reason that he realised these animals formed this special group of reptiles was because they actually have rather odd legs and hips, especially if you compare them to things like lizards and crocodiles. The legs and hips are designed for bearing lots and lots of weight for big animals. And they're also designed much more like our own legs, like those of a mammal. If you think of the way that you stand around, your legs are generally, when you're not drunk I guess, but they're generally directly underneath your body, holding up your body weight. But if you can picture in your mind a lizard, for instance, like the iguana down in the left-hand corner here, you'll see its legs all stick out to the sides of the body, its belly kind of slithers along the floor. And that's what you see in most living reptile groups, in lizards and crocodiles and turtles and so on. And Owen recognised that dinosaurs weren't actually doing that. If you look at those dinosaurs' legs, you'll see they're much more like the legs of a human, or indeed of a giant bird, like an ostrich, or of an elephant, such as the one up here. And actually it was elephants and rhinos that Owen noticed had these particular points of similarity. And so what he had was a paradox. He had a reptile in all aspects of its anatomy, except in its legs and its hips, in which it was much more like a mammal. And this is what led him to make this breakthrough and recognise these three animals as this very special group.
So what kind of material did he have to work with? You're saying that what he found was quite fragmentary, so he had little bits. Did he have a complete skeleton to work from to work out what these things looked like, or just bits of them?
No, it's a testament to how good he was as an anatomist in that he had very limited material to start with. He just had odd isolated bones here and there, really. So there were no complete dinosaur skeletons from anywhere in the world at this time, just occasional bits and pieces, a few bones joined together here and there. But on that basis, because he was so familiar with working with living animals, he was able to use his knowledge of that to work backwards and reconstruct what he thought, plausibly, these animals might look like. So this slide here shows some of his earlier attempts at reconstructing these dinosaurs, which basically shows them up as a cross between a kind of rhino and a lizard at the other end of the scale, these very ferocious, stockily built animals. And actually these are the reconstructions that you can still see today at Crystal Palace Park, because these are the blueprints for those famous models he built that were used for the Great Exhibition in 1851.
Can we just have another quick show of hands? Has anyone here been to see the models in Crystal Palace Park? Yep, me too. What did you think of them? Do you think they were scary?
I think that's quite good.
Would you go to them again?
Yeah.
So we've got one definite fan there. How accurate were the models compared to what we know today?
I mean, for their time they were very accurate because, as I said, they're based on very limited information. So with the benefit of hindsight, he actually did quite a good job on that basis. We now know, however, that that's not how these animals looked in most cases.
Right.
A famous example is if you look at this reconstruction here, this is of the iguanodon. It has this telltale horn on its nose, which he put there because he found this conical spike-like object. It seemed reasonable to interpret as a horn. But we now know it's actually the thumb spike of the iguanodon and actually on the hand, and probably a defensive weapon for stabbing predators.
Right. So how did he make the mistake to put it on the head?
It's an easy mistake to make at the time. As I said, there wasn't a complete skeleton or a complete skull. You have this thing that looks a bit like a horn, and as a result, and they only found them on their own, not with hands. Right. So he thought it's reasonable to make it a horn instead of being where it probably belongs.
So it was a fair enough assumption to make?
Yes, definitely.
So these are now what we generally believe dinosaurs did look like with current thinking.
Yeah, these are the actual three dinosaurs that Owen originally included in the Dinosauria, but modern day reconstructions of how we think they look. So the armoured one up here at the top is called Hylaeosaurus, and that's a type of armoured dinosaur. It's a plant eater. You can see it has all sorts of plates and spikes and so on, which would have been defences against predatory dinosaurs. And actually I have a plate of a Hylaeosaurus just here to show you. This is a real one collected from Sussex, actually.
Was this used by Owen himself?
Not this particular one. It was collected in the 19th century. Owen may well have been aware of it, but I don't think he actually published on this particular one.
Right.
But this is one of the plates that you would have found maybe along the side of the animal. So it's actually quite a chunky object, as you can see. These things would, the animals would get up to about 4 or 5 meters long and be covered in these. So we have quite a lot of these objects in the collection.
And they'd have been used for defensive purposes?
Yeah, they would have been a deterrent for things coming along. It would have been like getting a mouthful of concrete instead of actually getting anything useful to eat.
Right. Okay, so what other kind of things did Owen discover about the dinosaurs when he studied them?
Well, apart from actually just naming the group, he also named a number of different types of dinosaurs for the first time when material was brought to him and he was actually able to compare them with other things that were already known. And he actually named something like 13 new genus names of dinosaur and 18 new species. So it's quite a long list
so these are all
he actually came up with.
There's quite a lot of them there.
Yeah, that's right. And he was naming them over a very long time as well. Over a period of 40 years, he named these things, starting in 1842, which was the same year he actually described or coined the name dinosaur. Right. So he had you can see from just this, he actually had a very long publishing career.
What about today? I mean, you were saying that a lot of what he was working from wasn't complete. So, is there anything any mistakes he made in the naming that we, perhaps we don't recognise that as a species anymore, or was actually something else in fact instead?
Yeah, that's right. It's a very long list here, but if I now switch to this list, this is a modern list of those same names. The ones that are in orange, you don't need to read it or anything like that. It's just there to give an impression. But the names that are in orange are names that we no longer consider valid. We don't think they're dinosaurs that we can really identify properly today. But the ones that are in yellow are still recognised today. And the ones in blue are where he originally made one identification of the material. For instance, in some cases he thought the material he was describing was either a lizard or a gigantic crocodile, but subsequently, with the benefit of more complete information, been found to really be dinosaurs of one kind or another.
So it was a dinosaur he discovered, but because he didn't have enough material, then he didn't actually recognise it as such.
That's right. Now, a really nice example of that is the first one on the list, Cesiosaurus, which he described on the basis of this really fragmentary material to start with. Lots and lots of fairly featureless backbones. And originally he thought this was a gigantic marine crocodile. Other people had suggested it might be a whale, but he actually, although he got it wrong in that he thought it was a crocodile, he at least recognised it was a reptile. And actually it was a bit later it came firmly back into the dinosaur fold.
With some of the ones you said that we no longer recognise as dinosaurs, why don't we recognise them as dinosaurs anymore, or they're not observed anymore?
Simply because often what was happening in these days was they were making discoveries at quite a quick rate, but most of the material that came from southern England at that time was not very good. It's often very beaten up, large chunks of individual bones were missing. But because there wasn't any other material available, anything that looked even slightly different from what they already had often got a new name slapped onto it. But subsequently, when more material came to light that showed that either those same features occurred more widely in the group or they occurred in a sort of different set of ways, they became less useful.
Are we still finding this kind of material from these areas?
Oh yes, if you go to places like Sussex, if you go to the coast, Sussex coast, if you go to some of the clay pits in Surrey and in Sussex and in Kent, you'll still be able to go to some of the same localities that Owen and his contemporaries used to get their specimens from.
Have you found any yourself?
No.
Has anyone here been fossil hunting around those areas? Yeah? Has anyone found any bits of dinosaur yet? No? You have? What did you find? Do you remember?
It was recent, and I'm taking it to a friend at the American Museum of Natural History. But it was in Dorset, and I've had fair luck.
Fantastic. So we've got someone potentially bits of dinosaur over here.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I have a very bad eye for spotting bits of bone in the field, unfortunately. So I'm very jealous. I never found any dinosaur in the UK.
So we've got some other specimens here as well, but first of all, did Owen himself actually go out and collect any of these specimens?
Oh, you must be kidding. No, Owen was far too grand to get his hands dirty by actually going out and digging, or even cleaning the fossils once they were back in the labs that he worked in. He would get all of his fossils from avid amateur collectors who would go out and scour the beaches and scour the quarries and the road cuttings, and then they would come back and offer the material often to him to work on, or he would buy it, or in some other way gain access to it. But he never ever went into the field. He disliked it intensely.
So he was more lab-based then,
yes,
I suppose.
definitely.
What about, I know that there were two other dinosaur hunters at the time, Huxley and Mantell.
Mm-hmm.
How do they all compare in terms of how much they discovered?
Sure, well Mantell was actually the man who discovered and named two of Owen's three dinosaurs. He discovered Iguanodon and Hylaeosaurus, both from the rocks of Sussex, around where he lived. And he actually wrote a lot of work on those two animals, but didn't make the mental connection that they might belong to a special group of reptiles. And he also did lots of other work, particularly in the Wealden of the Weald area, and carried on doing that work all through his life, even though eventually it bankrupted him and his wife left him and all sorts of horrible things happened to him because he was so obsessive about these things.
So he was quite dedicated then?
He was dedicated to the point of madness almost.
Right, so going back to the specimens we have here, now what exactly do we have here?
Sure, well one of the other things here that illustrates the point nicely about why some of these names aren't valid anymore is this big lump here. And this is a vertebra, one of the neck bones of a big sauropod dinosaur, rather similar to the Diplodocus you can see in the main hall. Now, Owen, when he was presented with this material, thought, well, hey, here's a nice brand new animal here. He gave it a new name. It's got a rather tongue-twisty name, which is Chondrostriosaurus. And this name stuck around for a long time.
Could you say that again? Sorry.
Chondrostriosaurus. It's quite difficult, especially if you've got a lisp or a gap between your teeth. But he recognised this as a new type of dinosaur, but unfortunately we now know that the features that he thought made this particular animal special are in a whole group of animals, so can't be used to differentiate it from any other types of dinosaur.
Right.
So that name that's associated with that particular bone is no longer used.
And is this the original specimen?
That's the original specimen, yeah. So if you actually were able to do some kind of DNA analysis on it, there's probably some Owen dust or grime or something lying around on the specimen.
You would have actually touched this specimen?
Yes.
That's amazing. So what else have we got here as well?
We've got some other things that he worked on too, including some of the other material from original dinosaurs. So here I have a couple of very nice teeth of a megalosaur, that's a carnivorous dinosaur. And this is one that again was included within the original Dinosauria. And this is a carnivorous dinosaur, you can tell by its steak knife-like teeth. And again, these are actually specimens that Owen himself would have worked on. So again, for any future potential DNA experts who might want to reconstruct him, it might be a good place to come and look for some Owen DNA.
Right, fantastic. At this point, I'd just like to ask, does anyone in the audience who have any questions they want to ask Paul, either about the dinosaurs that Owen discovered or about Owen himself?
Where does Mary Anning fit in with all of this?
Mary Anning is actually older than Owen. She was active in the first couple of decades of the 19th century, and they did correspond. And Owen has worked on a lot of Mary Anning specimens that were collected from Dorset and which ultimately ended up here in the museum. They didn't interact very much, however. Owen was very much an ivory tower academic and never visited Dorset as far as I'm aware, in order to meet with her at least. But he did work on a number of specimens from Lyme Regis and Charmouth that Anning would have collected and that ended up here.
Okay, and I think we've got another one over here.
Mary Anning, she wasn't as famous as Richard Owen, but she did find the first ever pterodactyl and plesiosaur.
That's right, she did. And actually, Richard Owen described that first ever pterosaur. It's a thing called Dimorphodon, which is from Lyme Regis. And so that's another connection between Anning and Owen. And that specimen is also here in the Natural History Museum, the first flying reptile to be described.
So how much of Owen's original material do we have here in the museum?
We have an awful lot of Owen's original material here because he was originally the superintendent of the natural history departments of the British Museum, which was based at the site where the British Museum is today in Bloomsbury. But the natural history collections got very large, and they were very smelly because there are lots of animal specimens and plant specimens that were going off because they weren't adequately looked after. And the people at Bloomsbury didn't really want this because it didn't fit with their nice clean Greek vases and so on. And Owen was a very, very good advocate for saying we need more space, we need a proper facility. And as a result, he lobbied very hard through his political connections to get this building made. So he had a very big impact in that sense. It was an incredible achievement really for the time. It's basically a one-man drive to get that.
So it's basically thanks to Owen that we have this wonderful Natural History Museum.
Oh, absolutely. It's all down to him. Without him, this would never have happened.
Now, I think we've got a few more specimens here we haven't looked at.
That's right, we have. A couple of other things here, which I'll get to in just a second. There's some of the other Owen dinosaurs that are worth having a look at. This is just to show one of those dinosaurs I've already talked about, the Cesiosaurus, originally described on those very fragmentary bones. But we actually now have much better material of this animal, both here, but particularly in Oxford. They have an excellent specimen of this, if you happen to live in Oxford or near Oxford. And because of that, we now know it was actually not a crocodile as Owen originally thought, but this kind of Diplodocus type of animal. But it wasn't the only thing he named. He actually named, for instance, the first velociraptor-like dinosaur. This thing here called Nethetes. And Nethetes is from Dorset. It's known mainly from little tiny bits of jaw and little teeth, not very spectacular to look at. And when Owen originally named it, he thought that this was another lizard. And it was only a few years later he went back and he said, oh, it's maybe not a lizard, maybe a dinosaur. And that's actually what it's turned out to be. Right.
Has there been any further research on this particular specimen?
Yeah, just very recently, actually, Angela Milner, who's the other dinosaur paleontologist here at the museum, did a study of this material and actually found out not only is it a meat-eating dinosaur, but it's actually a very close relative of things like Velociraptor. and so actually would have been the first type of that dinosaur, which are called dromaeosaurs, ever to have been described scientifically. Though at the time Owen obviously had no conception of these animals. They weren't discovered until much later, with better material coming out of the Gobi Desert and places like that. So he actually got the first raptor, and this is actually our own little British raptor that would have been running around Dorset about 140 million years ago.
Good Lord. So it would have been quite a different place down in Dorset then at the
Yeah,
time.
you probably wouldn't have wanted to sort of fall asleep on the beach in Dorset in those days. Might have been quite bad for you. But getting back, just to give you an idea of what it might have looked like, this is a velociraptor, but our little Nephthiti is probably quite a small animal, maybe about 1.5 meters in length, so quite cute maybe if you weren't too worried about it jumping up and biting you or trying to pack hunt you while you're asleep.
Was part of the reason, I mean, I don't know if we know this, was part of the reason that he didn't recognise it as a dinosaur because he was expecting these dinosaurs to be these huge animals based on what he'd seen before?
That's a really good question, actually. I'm not sure is the honest answer. It may well be that, because these things were tiny in comparison with the big dinosaurs he was already talking about. And they do look a bit like lizard teeth. So it was a reasonable mistake to make, I think.
Okay. At this point, any more questions? Anything else? Okay.
Yes, what are scientists like yourself working on now? There are obviously many of you trying to understand better what went on. What exactly do you want to solve?
Well, me personally, I work on mainly plant-eating dinosaurs. And the questions I'm interested in solving are how did dinosaurs adapt themselves to deal with a diet of plants, which is actually very rare among reptiles. If you think of living reptiles, which have something like 6,500 species, only a handful of those, maybe about 50 or 60, actually eat plants in any appreciable quantity. It's actually quite a difficult thing for reptiles to do. But in contrast, dinosaurs, most dinosaurs ate plants. So there's obviously something they could do, but for some reason they don't do it today, and that's quite an interesting question to find out why they've lost that ability or why they don't do it as frequently as they did in the past. So that's the main thrust of my own research. But in general, people who are working on dinosaurs are interested in seeing how they fit in to our vision of evolution as a whole and how the ecosystems evolve also. Do ecosystems also always have the same kinds of animals in them? Do those animals always fulfill the same kinds of roles through time? And also dinosaurs obviously are involved in knowing about the origin of birds and also about phenomena like extinction. So they can actually still offer an awful lot of information to more general questions as well as being a specific study in their own right.
And I think we've got another question over here from the other dinosaur researcher over here. So,
there's this dinosaur called Stengosaurus, which was a dino man-like, and is a pyramid close to the Velociraptor and Deinonychus.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. This is a thing called Dinosauroid Man. A man called Dale Russell, who's a paleontologist in Canada, invented when he tried to think what would happen to dinosaurs if they carried on evolving in the same way and the extinction had never happened. Of course, we actually know that answer in that dinosaurs are birds today, so we have a little bit of an answer to that. But what Dale Russell dreamed up was a dinosaur that looked a lot like a human, where its brain had evolved to an enormous size and it had hands that it could manipulate tools with, and it looked rather like a science fiction character from a Doctor Who episode. And this was based on his studies on very intelligent small hunting dinosaurs like Velociraptor and a thing called Stengosaurus. And he basically took those very large-brained small dinosaurs and tried to think what would happen if it developed these more human-like attributes. Quite a fun thing to do.
yeah, that sounds interesting, although I'm not sure I'd want to meet one.
Probably not.
No. Any other questions we've got going on? Yeah.
Could you tell me what Owen's contemporaries would have thought of him?
Sure. Generally, they were a mixture of respect, fear, and mistrust. He was probably a very unpleasant individual in a number of respects. He was certainly very ambitious, but at the same time quite insecure. It seemed that he always had to put other people down to establish his own preeminence. He, in some ways, was underhand. In ways, he obtained specimens from under the noses of other scientists. But at the same time, he was a really brilliant man. He was very, very clever. And because of that, all of his contemporaries really respected him. They thought he was an excellent anatomist. So they were always trying to score points off him. And I suspect there was a big mixture of envy, jealousy, fear, because he had this very powerful position, as well as whatever personal quirks he may have had. that combined to make... He's generally been demonised since his death, particularly by people who are very supportive of Gideon Mantell, for instance, or of Thomas Henry Huxley, who in his own right was actually a very aggressive individual and could really hit hard in sort of verbal and written battles. But I think actually Owen, although he was a very good thing obviously for the museum and for science in general, probably wasn't quite as bad as most historians paint him out to be. But at the same time, I bet there was a lot of truth to that as well, and that if you crossed him, you really didn't want to do it ever again.
And any other questions you've got? Anything else? I see here we've got another lovely specimen here. Could you... I'm not sure if I should touch that.
Oh, no, it's fine, you can pick it up.
Oh, it's quite light, actually.
It's a cast, that's why you're allowed to pick it up.
Right. So what exactly is this?
This is the skull of a thing called Scelidosaurus, which is the dinosaur behind us at the moment. And Scelidosaurus is a very early armoured dinosaur, another plant eater, again from Dorset, and this one's about 200 million years old. And the reason why this one is particularly interesting is that Scelidosaurus was actually the first dinosaur for which a complete skeleton was known. It wasn't discovered until the 1850s, so after Owen had invented the concept of dinosaurs. But for the first time ever, he had almost all of the skeleton to show what the animal actually looked like. So this was quite an important animal.
So this is one of the first ones where you had the whole thing together.
And you could actually see how the whole thing was put together, and then use that as a way of trying to reconstruct the others more accurately.
So this is another one he would have worked on?
Definitely, yeah.
Why have we got why do we have the cast up here?
I brought the cast up because the real skull is actually exceptionally fragile. The bone is actually paper thin, and it breaks very, very easily, so we handle it as little as possible. But researchers still come and look at the skull very often because it's still very useful in terms of understanding dinosaur evolution.
Is much of the material we have quite fragile, or does it vary between being quite robust like this one here and obviously quite fragile like this one here?
No, absolutely. It varies completely from things that you daren't breathe near for fear of them, bits falling off them, to things like this big lump of bone here, which are quite solid. But even so, even these very big, robust things are actually sometimes quite fragile. Because they're so big, they can easily break under their own weight if they're not properly supported. If humidity gets in with them, they can cause cracking and expansion of the bone. So although they've been around in the ground for a very long time, as soon as you take them out of the ground, they become quite vulnerable.
Have we got anything that hasn't stood the test of time and unfortunately has been lost to science?
Yes, we have, but not for any of those reasons, unfortunately. Although most of the animals that Owen worked on were actually from the UK, in terms of dinosaurs, he also worked on some from South Africa. Because at the time South Africa was a British colony, and a lot of the scientific spoils that came from there ended up in London. And one of those things was this animal here called Massospondylus, which is a reconstruction to give you a better view of what it looks like. A very early dinosaur, again about 200 million years old, another plant eater. He described it on the basis of a huge collection of fossils from South Africa, including things like this vertebra here. And all of these things were actually housed in a museum at the Royal College of Surgeons, where Owen was working at the time. Now, unfortunately, the Royal College of Surgeons was bombed during World War II, and all of the specimens that formed the basis for that name were actually destroyed during an air raid. So this actually that I'm handling like this is actually a cast of one of those original vertebrae. And this and a few other casts here and in South Africa are the only remaining specimens of that particular set of material, unfortunately. So we do lose things from time to time due to circumstances definitely beyond our control.
Yes.
But at least we have some plaster casts of that one.
So it's not completely lost for all time?
No, so it means actually, because the cast is good enough, you can go back to it and still study it in almost as much detail as the real thing.
Okay. Now, lastly, I'd just like to ask, what are you yourself working on at the moment? What do you do on day to day?
Well, at the moment, I'm actually working a lot on dinosaurs from China. So I'm working on some animals very similar to Massospondylus, in fact, from about the same age in China, and also on Massospondylus itself. So although it's been around a long time, there's still quite a lot of work to do with it. I'm interested in that for two reasons. One, because they're very early plant eaters, and they tell us something about how dinosaurs learned to eat plants. And secondly, because we know very little about dinosaurs of that particular age, especially from China. So we're trying to increase the amount of knowledge there is on those at the moment.
Right, okay, well I think that's all we've got time for today in Darwin Centre Live, so I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here in the studio. I'd also like to thank our viewers for joining us over the internet. If you're interested in coming along to any more of the talks we have this week, we've got a lot of them coming up. If you'd like to pick up one of these leaflets, it tells you everything we've got to do with Richard Owen, the man who invented dinosaurs, all our events and the trail around the museum. Also, if you want to see any of our upcoming events further into the future, go to the museum website on www.nhm.ac.uk and click on the Darwin Centre link, and you can find out all about what we've got coming up. So all that remains for me to say is to thank you very much to Paul Barrett for joining us here in the Darwin Centre.
Thanks a lot.